So hi everyone, I'm here presenting my presentation on the ethical dilemma. I've chosen to present option 1, client leaving money in will. So my presentation is structured in 6 parts. The first part I'll briefly introducing the dilemma, and then I'll move on to the philosophical dimension, the ethical codes, some brief mention of the ethical considerations overall, the legal framework, and I'll come to some practical considerations and a recommendation. Okay, so the scenario, is a really brief statement. The client leaves a life-changing amount of money in their will to the therapist. Because we don't really have the context and we don't have a lot of details here. I think the first thing we should be, I would be doing would be considering the assumptions. Things like how did the therapist find out about this? Did the client inform the therapist of this will themselves, or whether it was the beneficiary or the lawyer? Was there ever a discussion around this in therapy? Is the client still alive or passed away? Does the client have any surviving relatives? When we talk about life-changing sum, what sort of figures are we talking about? Because life-changing sum could mean different things to different people. And whether this client is a private client seen by the therapist or whether it's a client through an institution. Because again, that might have very different implications. A client saying through an institution might be subject to additional standards imposed by that institution. Is this a short-term or long-term therapy? How long has the therapy been going? And also importantly, when did the therapy end, or is the therapy still ongoing? I think the ending of the therapy is also really important, because if the therapy ended a long time ago, and then later on the therapist found out this will, it might be argued, that's way more acceptable. Whereas if the therapy was still ongoing or only ended shortly before, then there's perhaps more argument of potential undue influence or exploitation. But we can go through this later in the slides. So here I'll briefly talk about the philosophical dimension. I've chosen 2 main approach to discuss. The first is consequentialist ethics. So consequentialism, is a big branch of ethics. It's mainly talking about the outcome or the consequences of action. So we're saying whether action is right or wrong is purely determined by the outcome. So utilitarian is a normative ethical theory that basically place the locus, the focus of right and wrong, purely on the consequences of the action. So if we apply a consequentialist utilitarian approach here, we may argue that because it's a life-changing sum of money, which is likely to bring a lot of financial benefit to the therapist, so that could be considered to be a good outcome, a good consequence. Therefore, the therapist is entitled to accept it. However, on the other hand, we might also have a slightly different scenario. If the person, the therapist, is risk averse, the person might think about the potential risk associated with receiving this bequest. Things like potential complaints to professional bodies, clients' relatives, beneficiaries contesting the will, and any sort of professional investigations, any inquiry into the professional conduct, any of the risks, reputation damage associated with this. The client might decide, given that their risk was that they will not receive these benefits, like this bequest, because they think the risk outweighs the benefits. So the other form of ethics, which I think could be relevant here, will be the deontological ethics. So deontological ethics is basically looking at the action itself, is ignoring the consequence completely, is looking at whether the action itself is right or wrong, and of serious rules and principles. A major form of deontological ethics is Kantian ethics. So Kantian ethics is focusing on reason, rationality, a set of moral universal principles that apply to human beings, regardless of context or situation. So it focuses very much on universality and applicability of the rules. So in this instance, we could potentially argue, because the bequest is basically essentially a form of gift giving. And gift giving for most of the psychotherapeutic modalities is either prohibited or disencouraged. There's very few modalities would openly encourage therapists to accept any gifts from the clients. So on that basis, we can take a universal approach and say the therapist should decline the gift because it's generally against the professional boundary and the professional framework. Okay, so now we move on to the ethical codes. As I'm training to become a counseling psychologist, I've decided to examine the requirements of the ethical codes in the context of the BPS Code of Ethics. So the BPS Code of Ethics is really a high-level code. It has 4 main principles. The first one is respect, and then competence, responsibility, and integrity. I'll just briefly touch on the elements which I think will be relevant to this case. Okay, so the first one I'll mention is respect. So the respect comes to we need to respect our clients, and we need to respect their consent, their self-determination, and their autonomy. So in this instance, we might be saying if we respect the decision of the client, if it's a consensual therapeutic relationship, the client is of sound mind, have all the legal power and the mental capacity to make that decision to leave the money to the therapist, then the therapist should respect that decision because it's the client's wish to leave the money to the therapist. So the next one I'll mention is responsibility. So, the code requires the members to consider, to accept and appropriate responsibilities for what is within their power, control, and management. And awareness of such responsibilities ensures that trust of others is not abused, and the power of influence is properly managed, and the duty towards others is always paramount. So, this is emphasized on professional accountability and also respect for the welfare of the individuals. So I think here it is really important because the therapist needs to be aware of the inherent power disparity exists between the therapist and the client. And then you need to ensure the power they have over the client is properly managed. It's not being overused or abused. That the therapy has to be conducted for the best interest of the client. It cannot be used as a form of exploitation for the benefit of the therapist. So there has to be a high level of accountability and transparency here. Okay, and so the last one I'll mention is integrity, which I think is perhaps the most relevant principle here. So when we talk about integrity, we're talking about acting with integrity all the time towards our clients and in our professional dealings. So this would encompass things as fairness, avoidance of exploitation, and a conflict of interest, including self-interest, maintaining professional and also personal boundaries, and also addressing misconduct. So integrity, I consider personally is the most important ethical consideration here. So this basically spells out explicit requirements of managing conflict of interest, particularly the self-interest. How do we set that aside to ensure the therapy is only conducted for the benefit of the client? And it talk about exploitation, how we deal with the potential exploitation in the relationship, what we can do to minimize and avoid such exploitation. So I think here, the modality practiced and how long the therapy has been ongoing, the actual relationship between the therapist and the client, and also the presentation, the client presentation that's been brought into therapy, they're all really relevant factors. Certain modalities, there's more accurate, there's more apparent power disparity, while other forms modalities, there's more assumption of client-centered approach and equality between the therapist and the client. So these sort of factors could be highly relevant. And also, I think it's very important to recognize clients come to therapy usually because there's something in their life bothering them. They're under some form of distress. So they come into therapy in a relatively vulnerable state. So, it's really important to ensure that, their interest and, even their financial interest are not being exploited because they are very vulnerable. Um, you know, Boundaries, both personal and professional, has been really paramount in the psychotherapeutic context. Gift giving, whether it's a small value items or a large sum of money, presents a lot of challenge to the professional boundaries and the personal boundaries. So that's why most modalities would discourage any forms of gift giving and encouraging the therapist to decline the gifts. However, some modalities would encourage the therapist to explore the meaning behind the gift as to why the client feel they have to leave this gift to the client. So I think, therapist is at liberty to explore the meaning behind the bequest. But I think, they have to be really, really, really cautious if they were even considering accepting such bequest because it presents a lot of professional boundary challenges. So when it comes to the ethical consideration on top of the code of ethics, I've chosen to use analogy with the medical ethics. I know, psychotherapy and medicine are very different. They're radically different. However, certain principles are commonly embraced, and fundamentally, we are all dealing with people who come to us for help and in distress. So I feel there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot that can be leveraged together. So the four main principles under medical ethics are respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. So respect for autonomy is very similar to the respect under the code of conduct. We need to respect the client's decision making and their self-determination. As long as we can be confident there has been no undue influence, the client is not being exploited. The principle of do no harm is, again, we need to act in the client's best interest. We need to be able to put our self-interest aside. We need to make sure we do not explore the client either intentionally or unintentionally. Beneficence, the principle of do good, again, is highly relevant here. The therapy has to be conducted for the best interest of the client. The client interest is paramount. The therapist is being compensated by the fees the client pays for the therapy, or is a voluntary agreement where the therapist is not being paid. However, all these financial consideration forms a very important part of the boundary that sits outside of the therapeutic relationship. So while we're in therapy, the self-interest has to be set aside. The therapy space is not a space to exploit the client, whether it's financially or otherwise. I think the principle of justice is also really interesting because, a bequest for the therapist is likely to benefit the therapist and the therapist's immediate family. It's very unlikely to have a large beneficial impact on the society. Again, if we apply for this principle, I think there's an argument for the therapist to decline the gift. So I'll briefly touch on the legal implication. As far as I know, under UK jurisdiction, there is no prohibition for the client to leave some of money in the will to a therapist, provided the will has been executed correctly under the right jurisdiction. However, there are a number of reasons where a will can be contested, and this is highly relevant to the case here. So just for the sake of saving time, I'll just mention two of them. The first one is undue influence. A will can be contested if vulnerable people, the client, can be seen as pressured or coerced into making the will. In this instance, the relatives or the beneficiaries, they can contest the will. And this is highly relevant because in a therapeutic relationship, because the power disparity, there is a high likelihood that the relatives would be able to bring a claim against the therapist because they could argue that the therapist has used their position of power in a therapist to influence the client to make that bequest. I think the other factor which might be relevant is lack of testamentary capacity. So this is where we're saying the will can be void if the client is not is not in sound mind, doesn't really have the mental capacity to be making that will. As mentioned before, clients come to psychotherapy usually under some form of mental distress, suffering, or potentially suffering from a mental disorder. So again, it is very possible for the relatives to bring a claim saying the will was actually made when the person is actually lacking the legal and mental capacity to be making the will. Thus, they can also make the will void. So having mentioned the legal implications, we're now coming to the final part, which is the practical consideration. So overall, having analyzed this case from an ethical, code of ethics and legal perspective, we can say it actually does represent a quite complex ethical challenge for a therapist. But I think the overriding principle is fundamentally each case needs to be reviewed individually. And we need to take into account of all the relevant factors we discussed above and then come to an informed conclusion. However, from both a professional and ethical perspective, it is generally considered standard practice to decline the gifts, especially when we're talking about a bequest of large sum of money from a client. So, the ethical implication of undue influence, power dynamics, and exploitative relationship, the risk of such factors are just too great. The therapist is also bound by general ethical principle of integrity and managing conflict of interest. Therefore, it's just risk or reputation damage, professional challenge is too great. However, there could be some exceptions. For example, if the client's relatives are fully supportive of this idea and the client is adamant they want you to make the bequest, they might be under certain limited circumstances. The therapist can accept the gift, but they also need to be aware of the potential legal and ethical challenges. If the bequest is made while the client's alive, proper discussion could be undertaking just to ensure all the implications are properly considered. However, if the client has passed away, this will leave the therapist in a pretty challenging and vulnerable position because relatives could easily argue undue influence. And at this point, the therapist might have to deal with professional inquiries, professional legal challenges. Therefore, they need to be aware of the risk and the challenge presented in this situation. There's also potential confidentiality issues. So if the therapist entity is not known to the relative while the client is alive, and they only discover the entity in the will, again, there's a question as to whether the confidentiality has been protected or breached. So I think overall, my recommendation would be based on the scenario, the default position is to decline the gift. Because I think the potential legal challenge and the professional challenge are just too great for the therapist to accept it. I think alternative approach would be the therapist work with the client and recommend them to anonymously donate money to a charity or a cause both the therapist and the client are passionate about. So that way the money is benefiting a greater group of people. Even if the client has passed away, the therapist has been given this money, this is still a recommended action of donating the money to the charity. So you can have a greater benefit to the society rather than keeping the money themselves. I think the main challenge of keeping the money is from an ethical perspective and also whether, it's acting in the best interest of the client and how do we manage the conflict of interest with self-interest.